Great. Hi, everyone. Good to see so many of you here. Thank you for coming. I am Emily Baum, and on behalf of the Long U.S.-China Institute, it is my pleasure to welcome Stephen Platt to UC Irvine. I have long been an admirer of Steve's work. It feels a little bit cliche to say that he makes history come alive, but I think in this instance, the cliche works, so I'm going to go with it. It doesn't matter if he is writing about the 19th century Taiping Rebellion, as he did in his first book, Autumn in the Heavenly Kingdom, or about the Opium Wars, as he did in his second book, Imperial Twilight. His writing is so engaging and so approachable and so human that as a reader, it is very easy to forget that you are learning about times and places that are completely removed from your own everyday life. Steve is now back with his third book, which is the subject of tonight's talk. It is called The Raider: The Untold Story of a Renegade Marine and the Birth of the U.S. Special Forces in World War II. And just like his previous two books, The Raider puts you front and center in the action. You forget that you are reading it from the comfort of your own home, and instead you are just transported to places like Nicaragua and Guadalcanal and Shanghai and Hankou. It is no surprise that Steve's work has been widely celebrated. Autumn in the Heavenly Kingdom was the winner of the Kundal History Prize, which recognizes the best history writing in the English language. And Imperial Twilight was shortlisted for the Baillie Gifford Prize for the best nonfiction writing in English. And according to his website, Henry Kissinger has called him a first-class historian and a superb writer.
Can't hear you in the back.
Okay, thank you. Which I have to say is something that Henry Kissinger has never said about my writing, but maybe one day someone will say something like that. Steve holds a PhD in Chinese history from Yale, and he is currently a professor of history at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Steve Platt.
Oh, thank you for that wonderful introduction, and thank you for having me here. Thank you, Emily and Jeff and everyone else here at UC Irvine. It's hard to understate like how the experience of coming from the frozen Northeast, where it has been cold and snowy and icy and dark. Our solar panels haven't generated anything since early December because they've been covered in snow that hasn't melted. And to come from that to Southern California and sunshine and vitamin D. So I'm very happy right now. You're going to get a happy talk. So to get started here, it's nice to talk about this book now. It came out back in May, and I've got enough distance from it now that I see parts of it differently from when I was working on them. This was my pandemic project. And as you know, like during the pandemic, everything sort of focused down to a very narrow scope. And I had my head in this book for years. And now that it's out and I can step away from it, I can think more about, and in broader terms, about what it meant to me when I was working on it. And what the main subject, Evans Carlson, really meant for me. So I wrote a little preamble here when I was in my hotel room this morning. As a historian, we tend to focus on individuals who function as a type, who sort of represent a certain kind of person or a certain class or a larger group. We write about a Qing official or a British naval officer, an early China scholar and what they represent about the British, a peasant rebel, what they represent about their peasant life in China, these sorts of things. Evans Carlson doesn't really fit this pattern at all. He was a United States Marine during World War II, but his politics and his outlook on the world were so completely different from his fellow Marine officers that he was utterly alienated from them. Most of them disliked him or even hated him, and he was remembered when he died in 1947 as being the black sheep of the World War II Marine Corps. So he was a singularity within the Marines. He was also, separately, extremely close friends with leftist writers like Agnes Smedley and Edgar Snow, who were really his two closest friends in his life. These are leftist American writers who were extremely sympathetic to the Chinese Communist Party. They were very close, but they were writers, and in his heart, through to the end, he was a military officer. He was a man of violence whose life was completely different from theirs. So I sort of picture him as a kind of a singular character at the heart of a vast Venn diagram, and which I didn't really realize at the time that I was working on him for this biography. And in hindsight, that's really how I picture him also in how he was sort of caught between China and the United States in World War II. He's quite exceptional in that he saw combat both on the Chinese mainland and in the Pacific. In the latter, he became one of the most decorated Marines of World War II. But again, there he was also unique in that he had also had his experience in China prior to that. He did not shape the relationship between China and the United States the way somebody like Joseph Stilwell did, FDR's military liaison to Chiang Kai-shek. But he could have if things had been slightly different. I'll talk about that. In any case, he was right there in the middle of the US and China in World War II, and the sort of the failures and disappointments of his life, especially at the end, point to some of the larger what ifs about the US-China relationship in World War II, and in particular, how this very hopeful alliance between the United States and China while they were fighting Japan fell to absolute pieces after Japan's defeat and would end a few years later with the Korean War, with the US and China going to war against each other for the first and as yet only time that they have done so, unless Jeff wants to count the Boxers. So I say that we are still today living in terms of the United States and China and our relationship, we are still living in the shadow of how World War II ended for our two countries. And Evans Carlson very notably saw that coming. So today in my talk, I want to give you really sort of a few snapshots from Carlson's life, sort of beginning to end. And at a basic level, this is really a story about how one American's life was transformed by his encounter with China, in particular in the World War II era. So to get started, let me make sure I know how to advance my slides here. Let's start with the beginning. Evans Carlson came from New England, my part of the country, born in 1896, ran away from home at age 14 and never went back. He actually tried to run away from home when he was 12 and only lasted a few months. But he was extremely restless from an early age. He wanted adventure. He grew up reading Ralph Waldo Emerson on self-reliance. And from Emerson, he learned that to be a true man, he had to follow his own inner guide. He couldn't follow the expectations of others, the guidance of his family, the guidance of teachers. He needed to sort of find the world for himself. And from reading his early letters, after he left home, he still wrote to his parents regularly. He always wanted something bigger in his life. He always believed that he was meant for something larger than what he had, which in the early part of his life wasn't much. The army was boring. Nothing happened for him. World War I came around and he finally got shipped over to Europe, but he didn't get anywhere near the trenches. His division was sent to the front just before the armistice was declared, and then they all shipped home. So his early life is really one of frustration. Things don't really pick up for him until he quits the army and joins the Marines to start over again. And so here he is as a young Marine lieutenant in the 1920s. He joined the Marines, as far as I can tell, because he wanted to go to China. He never gave any real explanation why. I think it was just an exotic locale. And the Marines had a permanent force stationed in Beijing, the legation guards. And he had this kind of romantic notion. I mean, really, for a kid growing up in New England in the early 20th century, there was nowhere on earth more exotic than China. So he joined the Marines. Initially, they did not send him to China, which he had asked for. But he finally gets to go in 1927. And he arrives in Beijing during the Northern Expedition, with a battalion of Marines who have been sent to protect the Americans in Shanghai from Chiang Kai-shek's forces. This is when Chiang Kai-shek was still working closely with the Soviets. And Carlson believed that really the next World War was going to begin right around him in Shanghai. That didn't happen. The Northern Expedition, Chiang Kai-shek managed to take Shanghai without killing all of the foreigners, which the Americans had feared. So Carlson finally gets to China. It's 1927. He knows nothing about the country. It's unclear whether he had ever even met a Chinese person before this time. And the language of his letters when he arrives there are pretty typical of an American Marine at the time. He writes about wanting to, quote, tame the wily Chinese, which is what he saw as the role of the American forces there. And pretty much any derogatory slur you can come up with about the Chinese from the 1920s is there in his letters somewhere. So for somebody whose life is going to be transformed from China, he comes with not a whole lot of respect for China or its people. And he writes in one of his letters to his father that we need to teach these people a lesson. If we don't, then they won't respect us properly. However, while he was in Shanghai, he figured out that the Marines had no intelligence service in China. And he'd always kind of wanted to try to get ahead. He had never even finished high school. He had always craved more education than he had. So he volunteered to become the 4th Marine Regiment's first regimental intelligence officer and started learning Chinese. This again was sort of pretty much on whim. But since they didn't have anyone else who knew anything about China in the US military, he figured he might as well. And he quickly fashioned himself the expert. He became the US Marines' expert on China, even though he was a complete amateur. His reports about Chinese politics were forwarded up the ranks. They were shared with US allies. And he started turning out these weekly intelligence reports from Shanghai based on his contacts in the KMT. And again, ironically, considering his later career, his intelligence reports were extremely anti-communist. The first glimpses of the communists that come through, he doesn't even know what Mao Zedong's name is. He shows up as like Mao Chok-tung and Mao Zedong in various forms in these things. But he describes the leaders of the Communist Party as being, quote, notorious communist bandits and how they're just rampaging in the countryside and they hate foreigners. And he very much hopes that they will soon be extinguished by Chiang Kai-shek's forces. In any case, he becomes more and more interested in China. This is an experience many of us who have become, Chinese history professors can feel familiar with, that he sort of gets swallowed up by this. And once he actually starts learning the language, and once he actually starts learning about China's history and realizes how much is there that he can't understand, it swallows him up. He writes a letter to his mother in 1929 saying, I feel detached from the outside world, and my interest in any arena but China ebbs with every passing day. And it got to the point where that was the only thing that was interested for him anymore. So he starts to share this with the US military. Here are some of the so-called China Marines. These are the US Marines who were stationed permanently in Beijing to guard the legation compound. In 1935, Carlson was transferred to the legation guard, where he started a Chinese course for the US Marines who were stationed in China. This is the first of its kind. He got permission to open the US legation, which is sort of the embassy at the time. He opened the US legation to Chinese visitors and started pushing for the American Marines to learn more about the people around them, engage with them, make friends with them, rather than just being sort of a surly military presence in China's capital. Oh, it wasn't China's capital. China's former capital. This is one of my favorite photos I came across in my research. This is around 1935, United States Marines teaching Chinese military cadets how to play baseball. So at this time, the Marines were teaching the cadets how to box, how to play baseball. The Chinese cadets were teaching them martial arts and sword play in return. The United States Marine Band was performing music in a local park for public audiences in Beijing. And this was an absolutely unprecedented moment of friendliness between the militaries of China and the United States in Beijing, or Beiping as it was known at the time. According to the colonel in charge of the US Legation Guard, he told a reporter, quote, "Wars are caused by misunderstandings between peoples. The more men of different races know of one another, the less chance there is for such misunderstanding." That obviously is as true today as it was then. For a contrary view, one of the Europeans nearby told that same reporter, "We are supposed to be here to keep the Chinese out, not let them in." He was angry that they were letting Chinese into the American legation. So at this point, His career is going along as an intelligence officer. He's going to try to interpret China for the US military. He probably would have continued in that path through the rest of his career, except for one of those strange twists that happen sometimes in people's lives, which is that in 1936, he was transferred home to do coursework at George Washington University. And during that time, the Marines assigned him to perform guard duty for the president. For FDR, who had a residence in Georgia, at Warm Springs, Georgia. It was an area that had hot springs that were thought to be therapeutic for polio patients like FDR. They could float in these mineral baths. And FDR had bought a huge piece of land there with the pools and built a foundation for polio victims. And had a house there that he went to in the holidays with his family, which was known as the Little White House down in Georgia. And Evans Carlson was in charge of a 60-man detachment of Marines that were supposed to protect the president down in Georgia. Now, this was a very easy kind of duty. There were no real threats to the president. Carlson was actually kind of frustrated initially because he would rather be working on his coursework at George Washington University, but instead, every time the president went down to Georgia, he had to go in with his Marine detachment and stand around. And mostly this duty involved him standing by the side of the pool while FDR floated around. But one thing about Evans Carlson was that he was an extremely personable guy. He was very easy to talk to, very friendly. Most people took a liking to him. And he's going to come out of this with a personal friendship with the president, who started singling him out. FDR invited Carlson and his wife to come to the White House for lunch, which is something that none of the other Marines at Quantico had been offered. And as the Sino-Japanese War became imminent, heading towards the summer of 1937, FDR chose Carlson to figure out what was going on in China. Carlson was on his way back to China. He was planning to be a full-time Chinese language student paid for by the Marines. And the president told him to come and meet him at the White House before he left. And so they had a meeting at the White House. And this is in June of 1937, just before the full-on invasion of China. And at this meeting, FDR told Carlson to report to him secretly from China via his secretary. So the instructions that he gave were that Carlson was to write letters to Missy LeHand, who was FDR's private secretary. And these were Dear Miss LeHand letters, as if they were personal letters to her. And she would secretly pass them on to the president to read. And what this effectively became was a direct line of communication from one mid-career Marine officer directly to the commander-in-chief that nobody else knew about. It was a tightly held secret. And it was an end run around the entire military chain of command, not to say the diplomats of the State Department. But at the bottom line, what Roosevelt wanted to know is what is really happening in China. And he decided that Carlson was the man that he trusted to find that out. So we turn the kaleidoscope of his life again. 1937, he arrives back in Shanghai just as the Battle of Shanghai is erupting. He arrives there a few weeks after the initial Japanese invasion. So Carlson is back in Shanghai with a full-on Sino-Japanese war exploding around him. And he starts observing the fighting. He gets within yards of the front lines at Shanghai, writing letters secretly to FDR to report on the fighting between Chinese and Japanese troops. And in the course of this, he starts becoming curious about the communists that he's written all kinds of derogatory things about in the past. He was friends with Edgar Snow. Those of you who know Red Star Over China, which was Edgar Snow's account of the Chinese communists on the eve of World War II, he had just written it at this time, and he shared a draft manuscript of it with Carlson. And Carlson had always thought of the Chinese communists as just being, violent bandits who killed foreigners whenever possible. And from Edgar Snow, he heard, well, actually, no, they seem actually very friendly and they seem open to an alliance with the United States. This was enough to pique Carlson's curiosity. And FDR had asked him to find out the whole picture in China. So he decided to try to make his way up to the north where the communists were. The anti-Japanese United Front had just been established. So the communists and the KMT, despite their on-again, off-again civil war, in 1937, they were technically allied. and China's Red Army had been redesignated as the Eighth Route Army. So the communists were part of the national military, which made it possible for him to get up to Shanxi and actually meet the communists for the first time. This is a picture from Life magazine of Evans Carlson with Judah on the left. So Carlson gets up to the field headquarters of the Eighth Route Army in Shanxi province, spends several weeks there, meets Judah, who is the sort of the tactical genius behind China's Red Army. Judah and Mao built the Red Army together. They were so close that people sometimes just called them Mao Zhu, Zhu Mao, as if they were one person. Carlson, as a lifelong military officer, was absolutely swept away by Judah. They spent weeks in close conversation. I have his diaries from this time, Carlson's diaries from this time. And Judah struck him as the most brilliant and unorthodox military leader he had ever met. That his tactics were so wildly different from everything that Carlson had learned before. And the loyalty that he seemed to inspire from his men was something that Carlson hadn't really seen before. So he spends a couple of weeks at Judah's headquarters. His diary is full of the things about the ingenuity and imagination of the Chinese Communist Army. At one point he writes, "What a magnificent fighting machine this is." And he's ultimately going to make 2 extended trips through occupied China in the company of communist guerrilla patrols. Here he is meeting Mao. And he leaves stunning diaries from these trips. But he's going to cover thousands of miles on foot, on horseback, on buses when they're available, in the company of Chinese communist patrols, much of it behind what are sort of ostensibly Japanese lines, through the areas of China that the rest of the world believes are fully occupied by Japan at this point. But he finds out just how porous the Japanese lines are. And he sees the kind of organization work that the communists are doing in the countryside. He meets peasant supporters. He sees the work that they're doing to sort of organize ordinary Chinese in the areas under their control. And he has just a succession of revelations about this army and its relationship to the people of its country. His diaries are full of observations about the discipline of the communist soldiers compared to what he's seen at the KMT. Their selflessness, their willingness to sacrifice, the advantages that they gain from cultivating peasants, and the way that they really seem to believe what they're fighting for. This sense that they have of a shared vision of the future is something that also is extremely compelling to him. And he believes that this is what really makes them so effective, in spite of the incredible deprivations. I'll go back to this one. The communist troops that he meets, these are partisans here, but he's writing to Roosevelt, or at least he's writing for Roosevelt. He'll mail the letters later on once he's in a safe area to send them. But he talks about how the communist soldiers, if they have winter coats at all, they're Japanese because that's where they got them, is from Japanese troops. They carry weapons won in battle. Some of the peasant supporters are just armed with spears. And yet they seem, from talking to them, from traveling with them, from spending time with them, he becomes quite convinced that they have been sort of made patriotic by the presence of the Red Army. And he comes out of this as an evangelist of guerrilla warfare. He writes to President Roosevelt that the Communist Army has, quote, developed a style of military tactics quite different from that employed by any other military force in China, and indeed new to foreign armies as well. He described how the officers and enlisted men were like fathers and sons in this army, that the officers led by example, not by pulling rank, that the officers suffered exactly the same physical conditions as the enlisted men. To his parents, coming back from this trip, he writes at the end of 1938, "I have seen a new China in the making." To the president, he writes that the communists, are the Chinese that the United States should consider working with if there's a war with Japan, which he saw on the horizon for the United States. And I should say that by the end of 1938, he was on the verge of dropping everything and quitting the Marines and volunteering for the 8th Route Army. He actually raised the possibility in letters home and to Edgar Snow. Very much like the Americans who joined the Lincoln Brigade to fight in the Spanish Civil War. He said that his sympathy for the people of China under invasion by the fascist Japanese had built to the point that he felt that he really should, like, the moral course of action was to drop everything and join their cause. They didn't want him, though. They didn't want him to serve in their army. And he actually winds up quitting the Marines anyhow, and comes back to the United States, and he quits the Marines so that he can be free to speak his mind to the American press about China. That as a military officer, he has to follow certain decorum. He can't talk to the press. So 1940 and into 1941, he's back in the United States, speaking on behalf of China. And he's going on a lecture circuit, talking about the Sino-Japanese War, drumming up sympathy for the Chinese and their resistance to Japan, lobbying for an embargo on the sale of war materials to Japan. But as soon as he senses that the war between Japan and Japan and the United States that he's been expecting seems imminent, and this is actually like months before Pearl Harbor, he comes to the conclusion that the war is about to happen. He re-enlists in the Marines. Because at his root, he's an American patriot. And it's one thing to quit the Marines and serve China at a time when America is not at war with anyone, but he believes that if the US is going to be at war with Japan, then the one place he wants to be is on the front lines for the US. So he re-enlists in the Marines. Along comes Pearl Harbor. One more turn of the kaleidoscope for Carlson's life. He's back in California, about 50 miles south of here. And here's where his friendship with Roosevelt comes back. That in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, when the US military is scrambling for some kind of a response to Japan, Carlson gets carte blanche from the president to form a commando unit in the United States Marines. Actually, FDR's oldest son, James Roosevelt, is going to be Carlson's executive officer or second in command in this unit. He gets his pick of any men he wants, whatever weapons they can get for him. He can organize it any way he wants to. This is going to be the 2nd Marine Raider Battalion. There were 2 of these battalions. Carlson's was the 2nd Raiders in California. There was a separate one, the 1st Raider Battalion on the East Coast, completely different unit. Carlson's group and the 1st Raiders, that these are the first modern special forces unit in the US military. They were supposed to be based on the British commandos, but Carlson made it clear from the get-go that he was going to model his on the Chinese communists. So this is a battalion. At its peak, it'll be about 1,000 Marines, which he is going to train on the model of the 8th Route Army, as he learned about in China. So in Southern California, with their initial training, they were doing 20-mile, 30-mile, 40-mile, eventually 50-mile overnight hikes. He tried to train them to endure and to suffer and to be independent in the way that the communist fighters in China had been. He taught them to cook rice in their helmets. Instead of having a mess or rations, they would carry rice in these socks over their shoulders or in their packs, and then they would cook for themselves in their helmets after making a little fire. He taught them small group tactics that he had learned from Judah, teaching them independence of movement, infiltration, raiding tactics. He had come away from China convinced that the reason, as he saw it, that Judah had been successful first against the KMT, and then in terms of holding off the Japanese, despite the material deficiencies of the Red Army, he said that it was their creativity on the battlefield, their ways of using weakness as strength, their ways of outpointing a much more hierarchical enemy. That the KMT military was much more regimented, the Japanese military was much more regimented than the Chinese communists had been. So he wants to create an irregular warfare unit in the US Marines. Furthermore, one of the key features of the second Raiders was what Carlson called ethical indoctrination. This is going to come back to haunt him. But this was their political training. And he believed that, as he said, he had learned from the Chinese that men have to know why they are fighting. They have to have a personal stake in the outcome of the war. They can't just be told to run into battle. They have to believe that they are personally a part of it. So for his raiders, he taught them that they were raiders for democracy. And he said, as long as we're going to be going and fighting for democracy overseas, we better have democracy within our battalion. So he modeled it like Zhuda's forces, that again, officers would lead by example, not by pulling rank. The officers and enlisted men would eat exactly the same food, live in exactly the same tents. They were all in it together, and they were a band of brothers. In terms of this ethical indoctrination, I should say as a side note here, that Carlson never really believed the Chinese communists were actually communist. He believed that they were fundamentally democratic, and that they just didn't realize that. So he was a better military observer than political observer. He always underestimated the actual communistness of the Chinese communists. But in his belief, he was really building a democratic unit like he thought Zhuda's army had been in China. So ultimately, the goal with the raiders was to combine Zhuda's finely honed guerrilla tactics from China with the best material resources the United States could offer. So unlike the under-equipped scavenging communist forces in China, the raiders were just loaded down with automatic weapons. They would be dropped by submarines for their island raids. They had special rubber rafts, all kinds of equipment from the US government. And their motto, which lives on in the English language, was gung ho. He's the man who gives gung ho to the English language. It was from gong he, and he meant it as work together. And he said it's a kind of cooperation between fighting men that leads to a special kind of courage that we all have to like gong he. And this would become a wartime motto in the United States, and it's still a slogan for the Marines in the US, although the meaning is somewhat different now than it was. So Carlson's raiders are going to become legends in the Pacific. They have their initial raid, I can talk about it later, was a complete failure, but they really salvaged the reputation with a 30-day patrol behind Japanese lines on Guadalcanal in November of 1942. This is the early part of the Pacific War. The raiders were living on rations of rice, salt pork, and raisins that would be dropped for them along the way. They were fighting in the jungle. They were practicing flanking attacks, long hikes, deceptions, nighttime movements. Carlson trying to put into practice what he had learned from Zhuda. And he writes to a friend after they come out of the jungle in Guadalcanal. He writes to a friend, "I used Eighth Route Army tactics almost exclusively. The old master's philosophy is the guiding force in my organization." And by the old master, he meant Zhuda. The raiders were stunningly successful in Guadalcanal. They killed 488 Japanese combatants while suffering only 16 combat losses. That's a kill ratio of more than 30 to 1. And Carlson became a war hero. Here he is receiving his third Navy Cross. The Navy Cross is the second highest honor a Marine could get, second only to the Medal of Honor. Carlson got it 3 times. Here he is getting his third from Admiral Nimitz. He was one of the most decorated Marines of his era, and the American press absolutely adored him. This is again in the early part of the Pacific War. Carlson was a household name in the United States. Here he is, the #1 guerrilla. There were press accounts that were all about like his mystique and all the secrets he had learned from the communists. One of the more over-the-top ones I can quote here. A magazine that did a profile on Carlson right after Guadalcanal and wrote about him, quote, this isn't the text here, this is from a different one. Quote, "Lieutenant Colonel Evans Carlson writes books, kills Japs, plays the harmonica, and speaks Chinese. He can deliver polished lectures on Asiatic problems, swim an ice-flecked river naked, and exist on a half sock of rice a day. He is a fighter, a philosopher, a man of action, and an intellectual." And his life sort of all comes together. The intelligence work that he had done, the Chinese language study, his travels with the Eighth Route Army, the heroics of his men in the Pacific, all sort of come together in this package. Gung ho becomes becomes a permanent part of the English language. There was a movie about his raiders in 1943 with the predictable title of Gung Ho. I love this poster here, the hot lead, cold steel Yankee guts. The movie was terrible. I mean, it was awful. It was also completely fictionalized. And it was about a raid that had actually gone completely wrong. But in the movie, everything goes right. So he was there in Hollywood. He was there in the American press. And according to a war correspondent in 1944, he was the most beloved officer in the Marine Corps to the enlisted men because of that egalitarianism of his unit. The way that the enlisted men were treated as equals to the officers. This, incidentally, is one of the main reasons that the Marines disliked him and why they would ultimately remove him from command, because they found this subversive to the overall ethos of the Marine Corps. The remarkable thing about all of his fame, and with Gung Ho and all his medals and everything like that, is that he was a darling of the American press. And I really want to emphasize this. He was a darling of the American press because of his connection to the Chinese communists. Let me just repeat that. He was a darling of the American press because of his connection to the Chinese communists. That was his strength. That was his mystique. There was nothing secretive or embarrassing about it at all. In a profile in Life magazine, we have Carlson of the Raiders, a student of Chinese guerrilla fighting, teaches his men both how to fight and what they fight for. This is Life magazine run by Henry Luce, who was rabidly pro-Chiang Kai-shek and hated the communists. Even so, in this profile, Carlson called the 8th Root Army, quote, the best organized, best led fighting force in the world for its size and purpose. And he gave the Chinese communists full credit for his training philosophy. So this is a reminder of just how sympathetic the Chinese communists seemed during World War II. That things get so shaped by what comes later in the Cold War that we forget what positive views there were of the Chinese communists when the US and China were allied against Japan. So one last turn here to the post-war period. Carlson's only going to survive for 2 years after the end of the war. He dies in 1947 after a series of heart attacks. The Marines had removed him from command on suspicion of being a radical. He's going to keep volunteering to go in as an operations officer and as an observer. And ultimately in 1944, he's going to be severely wounded on Saipan, and sort of almost perfectly for an officer who always devoted himself to the enlisted men and sort of tried to elevate them. He was shot by a machine gun while trying to save the life of a private who had been hit. Here he is in the San Diego Naval Hospital. He never fully recovered from his wounds. He had been strong and virile and could walk 50 miles at a stretch. After being wounded, he got gangrene in his arm. He was shot in the arm and the leg. He's gonna really wither away after the war. But here he is in the hospital being visited by Eleanor Roosevelt and by the Secretary of the Navy. The balding guy on the right is James Roosevelt, President Roosevelt's oldest son, who had been his executive officer. And a day or two after this photo was taken, FDR himself visited Carlson at the hospital secretly, had his bed wheeled out to FDR's car so that they could talk confidentially without anyone overhearing them. So he's got his friendship with the president, he's got his medals, he's a household name, but you can probably guess what happens to him in the post-war era. He's going to be attacked posthumously as a communist. He is eventually, after he's dead, he's going to be singled out by McCarthy for being a communist sympathizer, and he's going to become yet another victim of the Red Scare. Here he is at his peak, full-page color image of him in the Chicago Sunday Tribune. This was the peak of his reputation. According to one of the very few generals who attended his funeral at Arlington National Cemetery. And I should preface this by saying the US government refused to transport his body. He died in Oregon. The government refused to pay for his body to be transported to Arlington to be buried. That James Roosevelt had to take up a collection. According to one of the very few generals who attended his funeral, He recorded an oral history saying that the commandant sort of finished up with all the sort of textbook funeral arrangements and then basically dusted off his hands and said, "Thank God he's gone." That by the time he died, because of his politics, he had become an embarrassment to the Marine Corps. They wanted nothing to do with him. But there's something lost here. First of all, the Marines are still grappling with Carlson's legacy. After World War II, they wouldn't touch him with a 10-foot pole. After Vietnam, however, there start to be Marine officers who bring back Carlson, and some of whom suggest that what happened to the United States in Vietnam was proof that the US had jettisoned too much of Carlson's legacy. As one of them put it in a letter to the Marine Corps Gazette, the Viet Cong used gung-ho with devastating effectiveness against US forces. And by casting Carlson aside and ignoring all of the lessons that he had learned in China, perhaps that's why we got the drubbing that we did in Vietnam. Today, he's accepted as a pioneer of special forces, but in a sort of a narrow way. Also, there are many who still think of him as a communist. On a bigger scale, though, and here this is one of the last photos of him. This is him, his arm is in a sling, he can barely walk. He was speaking at a rally at Madison Square Garden, and where he was calling for the US to get out of China at the end of World War II. So coming back to this point here, on a bigger scale, what was lost with Carlson's legacy was the hope for a better future for China and the United States after World War II. The US rebuffed almost every overture from the Chinese communists during World War II. Truman took the side of Chiang Kai-shek actively against the communists in the Civil War. Carlson had been someone who was sort of in the middle of these events, who saw real possibilities for the United States and the CCP to work together and to find common ground. The end of his life here, this is probably 1946, because by 1947 he couldn't even walk. At the end of his life, he was an extremely vocal critic of Truman's intervention in the Chinese Civil War. And he argued to anyone who would listen to him that Truman was backing the wrong horse. In hindsight, back in 1946, 1947, there really was no other American better qualified to judge the likely outcome of the Civil War in China. At that point, Carlson was still the only American military observer who had spent substantial time in the field with the Chinese communists and who had seen the beginnings of the organization work they were doing with peasants that was going to be the key to their victory over Chiang Kai-shek eventually. The Shanghai Press called, a magazine called Carlson correctly, described him as being, quote, generally credited with having seen more of the war in the Far East than any other foreigner. So he had unique experience and he had very strong opinions. And he was absolutely positive that there was no way that Chiang Kai-shek was going to be able to continue holding power in China, even with American help. He never called for the US to support the communists, but in speeches like the one that he's making here, he said that the United States needed to remain neutral in China. The Marines should be brought home at the end of the war. He said, because as he saw it, the civil war in China between the communists and the KMT was so deeply rooted. It had so much historical background to it that there was no way that the near-term interventions of any outsider were going to change that effect, to change its outcome. Like, no matter what the Soviets did or what the Americans did, it was going to follow the course that it was going to follow. And as he argued that if the US intervenes and tries to stop that process, then they risk ending up as an enemy of the Chinese people. But by 1947, he was so thoroughly tainted by his admiration for the Chinese Communist Party that nobody would listen to him. So he dies predicting that Truman's intervention in the Chinese Civil War would be one of the greatest mistakes ever made in American diplomacy. And looking at America's relationship with China after World War II, and even looking at where we are today, it's hard to say that he was entirely wrong. Thank you.